what they do is run to the next.
No. To get a better perspective, let's go back and figure out why do I think that?
And visualize positive things so that I can get a positive result.
Men are under the illusion that if you suppress it, it goes away.
No, let him talk.
I'm here with JayCee today, and joining us is Lawrence Franklin, licensed therapist.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. I'm glad you could make it. And we got an interesting topic today, especially for me, because it's personal, and I'm learning. We're talking about deflection today, and so I'm so glad to have Justin's opinion and Lawrence's opinion, because I got my own thoughts on it. So I wanted to start by saying, or seeing if, Lawrence, could you give us a definition of what deflection is so we have a foundation?
Yeah. So deflection is actually, it's a skill that's either learned or something that we do to cope, that we do to get the attention off of us. So if we're trying to avoid feeling any type of blame or criticism, we will deflect and change the focus or the attention on something totally different or someone totally different. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kind of guy. So that word deflection seems to be a hot button topic right now. I mean, I'm hearing it on social media. I don't know.
All of a sudden it came out. I'm sure that's not a new word.
Nah, it's not. It just seemed like it came out of nowhere, actually. I think part of it is that there's all these different movements going on, right? So people are trying to find themselves in relationships, find themselves and figure out, like gaslighting is another term that just came out of nowhere, right? And so I think deflection is one of those terms that people are trying to figure out, is it happening to me now? Because people are saying that I'm doing it, but is it also happening to me? And really, am I doing it? So how do we distinguish in a conversation? Let me say this. Is there a such thing as good deflection? Because the word deflection seems to connotate negative. So what is the differentiator?
That's me. I would stay away from good or bad.
Okay.
I think deflection itself is useful, but depending on how it's being used, it could be harmful. So I'll give you an example that if someone is saying that, let's say a kid, like you tell your kid, like, hey, why are you doing this? Why'd you spill this milk on the floor? They can say, their sister, well, my sister gave me the milk. It's because of her that I even had this milk, right? And so what's happening in that moment, that kid is trying to get away from the consequence, and that could be serving him. But what it's also doing, it could be damaging the relationship, because now the mom is like, okay, I'm not able to work with you and teach you because now you're trying to shift all the blame on your sister right now. So deflection in itself could be helpful because it makes the individual feel safe.
Okay, the individual that is deflecting makes them feel safe.
And just because it's useful does not mean it's appropriate.
Got it. Okay.
That's a great example, and I totally agree. Like the fact that you can use deflection in multiple ways, it suits the person deflecting because they're trying to avoid a consequence, but the person they're trying to communicate with will just grow more and more frustrated because they're not getting the answers they seek, and that's part of good communication.
Right. And for me, this is something that affects me, like in a lot of my conversations, is because I didn't really realize I was deflecting. Right. So I can see, even though this is a hot topic in society, it's actually a topic that's personal to me, because I want to be the type of communicator that is not doing that and not having it done to me, but I want to make sure that I'm sending and receiving a message, and that I'm making it the conversation in such a way that my wife feels heard, respected, and that we can, get through the conversation. So that would be something as well as, like, is it sometimes that in society, it's like a mood, a thing is taking over, because it seems like it's everywhere right now.
Yeah. I think it goes back to just, I think our space of society right now, everyone's vulnerable. A lot of people are trying to figure out their lane and trying to figure out how they can relate to individuals. I think the pandemic really had a reset in a lot of relationships, as well as just perspective and the trajectory a lot of people are going in. And you think about that vulnerability of it, and as deflection comes in as a defense mechanism, and I'll explain what a defense mechanism is that it protects us from the emotional pain. The pain of being rejected, being judged, criticized, embarrassed. Those are some really hard emotions that someone might be feeling. And in that moment, in that conversation, they might not want to feel that. And so, and defense mechanism can be something unconsciously we do those things. Like someone ask us why you late, and we might blame or say something totally different, versus just say like, you know what, I'll apologize, I blew it. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's more risky to admit I made a mistake or I did something wrong.
Yeah.
Versus just really accepting it. And so deflection can be effective in keeping us safe, but it can be really damaging to a relationship.
And so as I mentioned earlier, a licensed therapist, when you are dealing with clients, do you see it as more of a male thing, more of a female thing? Is it across the board? Like, because it seems like, I'm not putting it on all guys, but I hear that I deflect a lot. And I'm not really intentionally doing it, but so is it more of a male thing, more female thing, or is it just across the board?
I think it's across the board, but I think when it comes into the dynamics of relationships, especially when I deal with couples, the men usually are the perpetrators who are deflecting the most, because those emotions we're talking about, it's really hard for them to express. Think about it, like a dude comes and say like, that hurt my feelings. Like it's gonna be really hard for them to really like, I didn't like how you said that right now.
Right.
So for them to say, well, you mad at me? Well, because I'm yelling. Well, you yelled at me. It's easier to say like, let's put it back on you, versus just saying that, you know, you're right. You told me that you didn't want me to yell, and so my bad. I shouldn't have been yelling right now.
Right. Like,
on that topic though, I think it's interesting because when it comes to being vulnerable, a lot of the times men are looked at to not be vulnerable, but then they are expected to be vulnerable, but to a certain degree. So it's hard to measure that sometimes, right? Because then there's also the term like man up. What does that mean? It means pretty much just don't be vulnerable, right? Just deal with it.
Get over it.
Get over it, right? And so it's like we almost have this weird situation where we're not supposed to be vulnerable because we're supposed to show the strength, but we also have to be vulnerable to answer certain questions and address certain topics. And that balance is so difficult if you're not linked up with the right person that is understanding and at least takes the time to understand what you're trying to say and not like summarize what you're saying differently than how you're saying it. So it's always this weird balance. And so deflection, I think, is not always on purpose. Like I don't think that it's intentional every single time where somebody answers a question differently than it was asked. But it could also just be instinctual, where that's just where their mind goes. Or maybe there's so many details as to why they're doing said thing that they just go into this nuance that becomes a little bit more confusing.
Right.
So it's like there's a lot of factors to it, and it can be intentional and hurtful, but I don't know if it's always, but it's a weird balance.
Yeah, when it comes to the deflection, when we say a defense mechanism, let's stay there, because some people can use it as an actual tool of manipulation.
Yes.
You really take, you talk about people with narcissistic personalities, you talk about gaslighting, like that type of deflection can be used as a tool to say, I'm going to control you, control the conversation, and I want you to feel less than. And so sometimes people use deflection to be really harmful. In this context, I'm talking about just really less of being harmful to others, but more so like self-preservation. Like I'm trying to preserve and protect myself. Yeah. And in that context, we want to focus on how do I want this relationship to work? Because like I said before, it could be really helpful in terms of protecting. Because if I was in a relationship with, it could be a coworker, it could be a professional relationship, and someone comes to me, I might not want to answer that question. So me deflecting can be appropriate for that context. Right. But if you're talking to a significant other, and they're asking like, why are you yelling at me right now? Or they're getting really upset with you in that moment. If you shift in saying, well, you yell at me, you're missing the connection that person's trying to communicate in terms of what the need they want in that moment.
Yeah.
That's good. I want to go back to what Justin just said, because that's what you both just said is kind of what happens in my personal relationship, right? Where
you yell at your wife?
Like think of it, so I grew up boxing.
Yeah.
I was, amateur boxer and all that stuff, right? And so I'm a counter puncher. Right. So part of my technique and my style in life is somebody will do something and then I'll counter it. So my wife may bring something to my attention and it triggers me and I don't realize that I'm deflecting, I'm counter punching, right? Yeah. And so it was a trigger that made me think about something. I'll give a simple example. It could be something that we're working on, the way that we manage dirty dishes, right? And so I want it done a certain way. She likes it done a certain way. and we're working to be accountable to each other. But say, for example, she did something 3 times and I didn't mention it at all. I just let it go.
Yeah.
And then as soon as I do it, she has the right to, because we both are accountable to each other. So when she brings it to my attention, I then remember that, oh, she did it 3 times. I just didn't mention it. This is a good time for me to mention that.
Yeah.
Right. But I've turned the conversation, instead of it being about me, now it's about her. But in my mind, it's about us resolving it together because I forgot, or I didn't have time, or it didn't matter as much for me to bring it up then. How can I be better in those situations? Because I really don't mean harm.
Yeah. I like your analogy of boxing, right? I never boxed. I tried a class and I was feeling good. So you can relate to this. So when you box, you come into the ring, is your hands up or your hands down?
They up.
They up, right? Because why?
Always protect yourself.
So if you think of it, if you're engaging in a conversation with your spouse and you're deflecting or counterpunching, the presentation is that, or the idea of it is that you are then guarding and you're protecting yourself when it's a person that you're supposed to be trying to build intimacy with. Right. And so if someone's coming up and you feel like they're going to punch you and you're preparing for a counterpunch, you're maybe missing something that what the goal is, or what the person's trying to communicate.
Right.
And so in that space, if the person is trying to communicate something that could be harmful or hurtful or judgmental or criticism, if you're taking that as they're trying to hurt me, it would make sense that a counterpunch would take place because it's like, you hurt me, boom, I'm trying to hurt you. Well, if we reframe that and say this person is trying to repair our relationship, they're trying to make us better, they're trying to work on our intimacy, let me hear what they have to say because I don't have their perspective and I want to hear what they have to say so I can be a better spouse to them, a better communicator for them.
Yeah.
So let me know their needs and so I can help them with that, or I can provide something to them. And so the perspective and the presentation of that is really important.
Yeah, I want to say, so sometimes as a counterpuncher, right, I'm not trying to hurt the person. I'm trying to just get them off me for a second, right?
Great.
So I'm not throwing a punch to damage them. I'm just trying to hold them off for a second, right? So sometimes in the conversation, I haven't had an opportunity to process or whatever the case may be. So I'm just trying to have a standoff. Like, let's just hold on. We had an impasse, right? And so let's just hold up for a second. And the reaction, which I got to get better at, is to throw that punch just to get space, right? It's not to hurt or wound. And so what you're saying now is making me think of something that I've learned growing up. We always say, you can't get nothing like this but a fight. So you have to be like this in order to give and receive. So instead of coming to the situation as a counterpuncher, come to the situation as I am open to receive. So this is gonna, definitely.
I got a question. I'm gonna shoot it to you, JayCee.
Okay.
Why do you think some men approach their relationships with their hands up versus, like my man said, about keeping their hands down? Why do you think?
Man, I think the world just expects that of us. Honestly, like if you think about it, the more vulnerability you show, the worse you seem in whatever you're talking about. So whether it be at work or whether it be in your relationship, you start to be looked at less than if you admit mistakes, as opposed to you just own up to it and provide a solution. Although you would think that would be more respected, I've found a lot of the time, especially in corporate America, they actually don't respond well to that. Or in relationships, some people, not everybody, right? But some people don't respond well to that because they almost just want to hear what they want to hear. So one thing I like to tell people, I mean, I'm sure I'm guilty of it too, as far as deflecting, but if I ask a question and that question wasn't answered, but you said a lot of things, well, then all that stuff was unnecessary. So if I'm asking you what's your favorite color and you're telling me about lasagna. We didn't talk about the favorite color yet. Right. You know what I mean? So I think that's definitely a thing where, and sometimes I have to go back and think about it when I'm talking. Like, okay, she asked this. Did I even answer that? I said a lot of words, but did I actually answer that question? Like you said, with the kid analogy, when the mom asked, why did you spill the milk? And you're talking about your sister gave you the milk. We never got why you spilled the milk. Like, what happened? Did you drop it? Did it slip? Were you running? So it's like thinking that way too when communicating, like, okay, did I address their concern? That could kind of help a little bit, but it's hard in the moment sometimes.
Can something be baked into our DNA, right? And the reason I'm saying that is the story, the callback to milk being spilled. Think about from the beginning of time, right? In the garden.
The garden.
Eve had a situation. God comes and asks Adam, why did you, and is that deflection? Did he deflect? Was he the first deflector?
Yeah, I think you're onto something. Sin in itself, and you think about how the enemy try to trip all of us is attacking our identity, right? And so shame is a tool of the enemy, right? And so shame can be really hurtful. You know, rather than say you did something wrong, the thought is that I am wrong, and to avoid that feeling is let me get the blame off someone else. The woman you gave me, she the one did all this, not me, right? And so think about even that dynamic of how sin can impact even relationships, where you can't even get resolution in a conflict at the time. Even what you said earlier about the whole box analogy, right? Remember that if you're engaging someone and you're trying to develop that relationship intimacy, part of communication is not always the same, but listening, and being able to figure out what exactly are they saying versus like, how do I protect myself? Because when you're in defense when you're in defense stance, when you're trying to protect yourself, 9 out of 10, you're not listening, because that can lead you to be really harmed, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're approaching someone and you have an experience with that individual or experience outside that individual, they can be hurtful. They can see a insecurity that I might have. We come into that relationship really guarded, and that can be a barrier to intimacy, a barrier to really get to know that individual because we're in self-preservation.
We were talking off camera before, and one of the things that I wanted, and my wife does it, and she said it, but I wanted you to give us some examples, or give us an example of how it can be a win-win, right? So is there a template? Is there a phrase? Is there some way that we can allow ourselves to not feel the fear or not feel the pain in that moment, and not deflect, and be able to have the conversation that the other person wants to have that is directed to us, but then in that same conversation be able to say at a later time, or so, how can we make the person heard, but also get your point out in that moment without offending?
I think the first step is understanding that we all make mistakes. Like, we all got issues, we all got baggage, and none of us got it all together.
Right. And
just being comfortable in who we are and identity, and knowing my stuff stink, it happens, right?
Yeah.
And so when we get criticized or when we get faced with things that could make us feel uncomfortable, we've already had a understanding of who we are. So, okay, that happens. And so if, say, for example, a wife or a spouse comes to a man and say, hey, you left the dishes in the sink again, I can see that. Like, I've done that before. So is it too far-fetched for her to get upset with me for leaving the dishes in the sink? Yeah. And if you're able to accept that, then the wife's guards are down, they're able to receive what you have to say, and then a conversation and resolution can take place. But if everyone's in self-preservation mode and defending themselves, it's really hard to be on the same page, on the same team, if everyone's really butting heads and fighting. And so to answer your question about how men can work on that and improve in that, I think first understanding that we all make mistakes. The second aspect of it is understanding the role in that relationship. And so in the scenario that we keep talking about, how can I meet the other person's needs? Like, what are they saying they need from me? And being able to listen to what they're saying and reflect that back. Like, oh, that really bothers you. Like, my intent is not to bother you. My intent is to make sure you feel heard and valued and that you cared for. And so being able to highlight that can be really helpful in that space. Because at the end of the day, it's all about making that connection.
Okay, so, and what I also am hearing in there is that when you're engaged in that type of conversation, you got to accept your role or responsibility in that, and then be accountable to the person, acknowledge that you've heard and that their feelings matter, right? And then in that moment, you can also say, hey, this has triggered something in me, I want to continue the conversation at another time, maybe not this conversation, I'd also like to bring up, because it's some unresolved issues in this same topic, right? And then go back to the conversation and be in the moment. In that, okay.
And I would say too, there's also something to knowing somebody's uncomfortable with a certain topic and being understanding of, okay, maybe we don't address this completely right now. As the listener, as the person who's getting deflected, all right, maybe you're not comfortable with addressing it right now. However, just know this topic needs to be revisited. I've been through that scenario where it's like, maybe there's something that I did that made her uncomfortable. And I'm noticing she's upset, but she's not answering why she's upset. She's deflecting completely. She's saying nothing's wrong and then just asks me what I want to eat or something. I'm like, something's definitely wrong. But it's in that moment I have the decision to make. Like, I could press and be like, no, you're deflecting. Something is wrong. You're not telling me. And I can start getting upset because now I'm not getting what I'm asking for. Or I could then be understanding, like, okay, I understand you need some time. I gave her some time, gave her a day to just kind of process it. And then afterwards, she explained to me, like, she was deflecting and not wanting to speak about it because she didn't want to just blurt out her emotions. She wanted to process it so she could really understand, am I upset over something like that's actually worth being upset over? Or am I building up this thing in my head? And after she processed that information, we had a really good discussion about it. So that's where I think both sides kind of came together. It was like, yes, maybe she was deflecting. And yes, I was able to identify it. But instead of it being a problem, we found a way to resolve it by just, okay, we need a little bit more time on the subject. We'll just revisit it. Because I don't think everything necessarily has to be addressed on your timing, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody has their own individual timing for each individual issue. So I think there's both sides can come together when they identify that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point right there, but that's about being aware, right? And so that's part of even having an opportunity to have a good dialogue is coming into it and saying, I'm going to be aware of the atmosphere, the mood, the temperature, right? As opposed to, like, sometimes you're in that moment and you automatically get defensive, right? When if I was aware, her body language or his body language didn't come to me that way. So why am I, right? And say, oh, I'm aware of my feelings right now. I'm getting heightened for some reason. Give me a second so that I don't put that energy on you. I'm not in a place, right? So you can be aware of the other person, but you can also become aware of yourself. So that's really good.
They both have needs that need to be addressed, right? There's the need of being heard. And in that scenario that we're talking about, the male might feel like I need to feel safe.
Right.
And so is it more productive and is it helpful to then criticize the person who's also trying to need help in that moment, right? So it's almost like there's someone says, I'm bleeding, I need a Band-Aid. And the person says, well, I'm bleeding, I need a Band-Aid. It's like, well, if the person's come to you for help, first acknowledge the person, say, like, I need to get help. Once you help them, then they can get addressed and say, hey, by the way, I'm also bleeding. Can you help me as well? Right. So if everyone's in panic, everyone's not getting their needs met, then it becomes like, I don't see you, I don't trust you, and my needs are more important than your needs right now, and no one's needs are getting met. But if the person's coming to you and you could tell them, yeah, I'm sorry, I see that you have this need right now, and then you can have a conversation about how you can meet that need, what your resources are, what your limitations are, to say, I can't help you with this, I can't help you with this, and then bring up later your need after you address their need. That could be really helpful.
Justin, Lawrence, man, good conversation. I wish we had some more time. Maybe we can revisit this topic soon. Appreciate it. You did an amazing job. Hopefully our listeners were able to get something from it, because I definitely did. Some stuff I can apply. I'm going to actually look at this episode myself. So thank you for hanging with us today on his side. All right. Awesome.